there, my name is Michael Grasinski. I'm president of Real Woods Press. I'm very excited to be here with you all from the Diocese of Providence, and I'm here to talk about a great passion of mine, of course, which is theology of the body. That's why I'm the president of Real Woods Press. And I would like to start you all off here with the thesis statement from the Theology of the Body to set the context for this whole talk. The body, in fact, and only the body, is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and divine. It has been created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden from eternity in God, and thus to be a sign of it. TOB 19:4. So that's a lot to unpack there, but that gives you a little taste of what theology of the body is all about. Really, it's just an explication of the human person. Where are we from? Where are we at now? And where are we going? And of course, we know that Christ reveals us to ourselves. And you'll hear that probably a lot from me. But what we have to think about here is that we are living in a world where many people are lost, confused, and we're in a stage of combat, quite frankly. And our radar is jammed, and we're being led astray by wrong signals. In fact, has there ever been a time in humanity where we have more signals leading us astray than now? I would say no. So imagine if we're in an airplane and we lost our lights or our cockpit lights, and we lost our radar and we're being led astray. We don't even know what our altitude is anymore. We have no clue where we're going. This obviously creates a tremendous amount of problems. And this is kind of the human condition. And the distortion of the human person is really everywhere. And the possibility for despair is too great, unfortunately. And many people who are not anchored in any sort of truth about their existence then are led to fulfillment in all kinds of things that can't actually fulfill. And we too are possibly led to despair. We see that all throughout our society, whether it be suicide, whether it be addiction, drugs, alcohol, anything we can do to cover up the confusion, the suffering, and all the things that come from a lack of hope. But one of my favorite quotes is from John Paul II when he first became Pope. I'd like to read it to you here. "Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. So often today, man does not know what is within him, in the depths of his mind and heart. So often he is uncertain about the meaning of his life on this earth. He is assailed by doubt, a doubt which turns into despair. We ask you, therefore, we beg you, with humility and trust, let Christ speak to man. He alone has words of life, yes, of eternal life." And as we know there, John Paul II is pointing out the fact that Christ is that light that shines in the darkness. When all the lights go out and my navigation is gone, to use just kind of an analogy, he's the one that leads us home. And John Paul II knew that better than anyone. And as we read in John 1, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And such it is with Christ, that he is the light that can lead us back to where we're meant to be, which is ultimately leading us to human fulfillment. The church is not here to oppress us, not here to cast burdens upon us, but is here to liberate us. Christ came to liberate. He said he came that they may have life and have it abundantly. He did not say that he came so that we might be slaves still. In fact, he said that I came to make you free, and if you are free indeed. And so John Paul II's theology of the body is completely Christocentric. It starts off from a position of calling us back. The Pharisees tried to engage Jesus in conversation. I don't know if I'd call it conversation, argument. And they tried to trap Jesus. But Jesus obviously knew better. And he knew that these people didn't understand the truth of the human person, as learned as they were. They did not understand the basics, the fundamentals of who the human person was. Thus, they could not understand marriage. And there was no point arguing with them because they weren't going to understand. How can you not understand the foundation and then think you're going to get the problems with the scaffolding? You're just not going to get it. And so he pointed us back to Genesis. And we will get a little bit more into that as we go on here. But to kind of prep you here as well for kind of what we're doing here, we have to think about it in context of that when sin knocked out the lights in Genesis, We are promised a light to guide us back home in Genesis 3:15, which is known as a proto-evangelium. And so Genesis marks kind of the cornerstone for anthropology, for certain. And that's what Jesus pointed us to. And John Paul II took his unique experience and education and his prayer life, and he was able to mine that and to make an incredible presentation and expression of the truth of who the human person is. I would also like to mention this quote from Gaudium et Spes 22 here, which really sets the table for all this. The truth is that only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. For Adam, the first man, was a figure of him who was to come, namely Christ the Lord. Christ, the final Adam, by the revelation of the mystery of the Father and his love, fully reveals man to himself and makes his supreme calling clear. It is not surprising, then, that in him all the aforementioned truths find their root and attain their crown. So Gaudium et Spes, the great document from the Second Vatican Council, of which St. John Paul II had a tremendous impact, is pointing us toward the incarnation. That is the center point of the universe and of our reality and the explanation of our very lives. That God became man. Christ wasn't patterned after us. We're patterned after Christ. And so he reveals us to ourselves. What are we meant to be? Ultimately, we are beings who are called to love. And we don't just mean that as a loose sentiment, but we are called to make a gift of ourselves, to love others, to exist for others. And far from being a burden cast upon us, this is our greatest joy. But we do experience the effects of the fall in concupiscence. That's a fancy term for meaning we still experience the temptation to selfishness, to consuming and using others. But we can find relative freedom in this life. And ultimately, as Gaudium et Spes says here, we will find freedom in making a gift of ourselves because we're meant to become like him, that being Christ. So theology of the body is a roadmap for humanity, most especially children. So let's bring them home. Christianity is an embodied religion, as Father Calloway says, Father Donald Calloway, that is. And without a proper understanding of the body, Christianity cannot be fully understood. Any talk of Christianity seeing the body as bad, or a dualism, the spirit's here and it's good, and the body's here and it's bad, that is utterly foreign to Christianity. Christianity is above all an embodied religion. It is about the redemption of the cosmos, that when Christ became man, the entire cosmos was then at the foot of redemption, that Christ came to restore the integrity to all of creation, not just man. When man fell, the cosmos fell with him. And so the woundedness of man led to the woundedness of creation. But Christ comes to restore. And the theology of the body has a special power to be able to do this. To understand Christianity in this context is to understand humanity. There are some who would say religion obscures what's most truly human. But in fact, what's most truly human is religious, because religious, by its very word, points to relationship. And we're called to relationship from the beginning with the one who created us, and that is God, the most holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Christ points us back to the beginning because we need to remember we're like beings who have spiritual amnesia. And so we need to go back to the beginning to understand who we are and where we come from. And John Paul II had this question of personal identity deep on his heart. He said, "You are not who they say you are. Let me remind you of who you are." He said that in 1979. And he had such a keen understanding of the human person and the need to understand the human person. But before I get too much into that, I want to do a quick overview, too, of John Paul II so you can understand the man behind this work and then thus understand it as well. And I know we don't have a ton of time here, so I want to make sure that we are trying to capture what we can. Kierowolski, aka that's John Paul II's name, was born in 1920 in Wadowice, Poland. He was born to Emilia. He was born to Amelia and Carol Sr. Unfortunately, he experienced a tremendous amount of of tragedy in his life. John Paul II lost his mother, his brother, his father, all before he was even 23. And he actually lost his sister, too, who died in infancy. John Paul II later said regarding all this, "I was not at my mother's death. I was not at my brother's death. I was not at my father's death. At 20, I had already lost all the people I loved, and even those I might have loved, like my older sister." You see, John Paul II could have given up. Around this time, too, the Nazi invasion took place. He was thrown out of his school. His teachers were killed. His friends were killed. His home was destroyed. He had every reason to give up hope. And then after that, the Soviet occupation came. And so John Paul II had a keen awareness and understanding of the violence that's done to the human person by those who are not grounded in the truth, who are not grounded in revelation, whether it's communism, whether it was socialism, Nazism, whatever you want to call it, all the isms. Theology of the body is an answer to those isms. And John Paul II, far from giving up, was the same one who said, "I plead with you, never ever give up on hope, never doubt, never tire, never become discouraged. Be not afraid." So this man was truly edified in these times, and it had a lot to do with the creation of the theology of the body, his experiences during this time. His experience as a quarryman, too, had a huge impact on him. He later said that his experience as a workman, hard labor, meant more to him for his formation than all of his studies. And that's really incredible. And he went on to later give a lot of attention to the dignity of work. So this is a man who came to have a keen sense of the truth of the human person and all those things that would obscure the greatness and dignity of the human person as unique and individual, made in the image and likeness of God. So what is theology of the body? We've said that word probably, I can't even count how many times so far, 50 or so? What we can tell you is that what we know as the theology of the body were John Paul II's Wednesday audiences given from 1979 to 1984, but really they were a fruit of his lifetime of study. I wish I could dive into that portion with you. That's some of my favorite stuff to look at, but we only have so much time here. Safe to say that what formed him so much was phenomenology, that is, the human experience and examining it, in the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, and not to mention the Carmelite tradition and mysticism deeply impacted him. And this would later go on to have a huge effect on his reading of Genesis and where we got the theology of the body. George Weigel, his biographer, famously said, maybe you've heard this quote before, theology of the body is a kind of theological time bomb destined to go off with dramatic consequences sometime in the third millennium of the church. So this is something that has tremendous relevance for our time, more so now than even when it came out and it was given. So the theology of the body is, you can get it in a kind of a big text that's printed by Pauline Press, and it's called Man and Woman, He Created Them. But it's divided into two halves. The first half is the words of Christ. Chapter 1, Christ appeals back to the beginning. Chapter 2, Christ appeals to the human heart. Chapter 3, Christ appeals to the resurrection. The second half is called the sacraments. The dimension of covenant and grace is the first chapter. Chapter 2 is the dimension of sign. Chapter 3, he gave them the law of life as their inheritance. So what you can see here, what John Paul II was doing was he was first taking an approach to understand how can we understand man. Then once we understand the foundations of man, how does that inform our understanding of the sacraments and vice versa? And so, again, we've said it again, Christ appeals to the beginning. He points us back to Genesis to discover who we really are. Then Christ points to the human heart to help us understand the human condition, especially sin, especially the effects of that sin and that darkness and that evil at times that we feel in our own hearts that cause us to harm others, to forsake God, and to simply use others as a means for our own pleasure or gratification in whatever way that might be. And so, far from condemning the heart, Christ calls the heart, and that's what John Paul II really focuses on there. Then he appeals to the resurrection. Now, this is my favorite part of the theology of the body, because in this part of the text, John Paul II goes into a great study on what will we be like in the resurrected state. How can we understand our embodied state as male and female in heaven? What will that be like? And of course, he asserts that we will retain that maleness and that femaleness, and that it's at the core of who we are. And so there's a great dive into the future state of man, the man of the resurrection. And so when you understand the beginning, the human heart in the resurrection, you understand that what he's doing is saying, where are we coming from, the beginning? Where are we now, the battlefield? And where are we going, the beatitude, right? So before the fall, after the fall, and in heaven, the resurrection. And then the second half of that, again, that's getting into the sacrament of marriage, and helps us to understand how all these teachings can inform understanding of marriage. Because John Paul II was responding in large part to Humani Vitae and the kind of the backlash that happened with Humani Vitae. So many people rejected it, and he said, listen, until someone understands the human person, again, just like the Pharisees, then of course they might reject this. And so he felt that we needed a total vision of man, and that is what the theology body does. But in a certain sense, how our theology, which is the study of the data of revelation, and the body related, those seem to be contraries, right? Wrong. In fact, again, like we've said, the Word became flesh. God became man. And as John Paul II says, theology entered the world through the main door. So, again, you can see how Christocentric all of this really is. And in TLB 23:4, which is the numbering that exists in the text, we read, the fact that the Word became flesh, the body entered theology through the main door. So that's a seminal statement there for John Paul II as he's establishing the ties from the incarnation to our very own existence. Now, to dive a little bit deeper into this, we can understand that what we've talked about is a dive into original man, historical man, and eschatological man. Don't worry if any of these phrases seem a little bit much. It's what we just talked about, the beginning, the battlefield, and the beatitude. John Paul II is saying, how can we understand who I am if I don't understand these three ages, these three phases of man? I wasn't there at the fall, but guess what? We still experience those effects of the fall, good and bad. We can experience what we call echoes of Eden, meaning I can experience these phenomena that are a direct corollary to the fall. Again, in the negative sense with sin, but also in the positive sense from in the beginning, in the integral state of man, that I'm created to be in union with God. I'm created in a unique relationship with God that is unrepeatable. And I'm alone before God in what John Paul II calls original solitude. And then I'm also created in the beginning in the integrity with original unity, meaning I'm meant to be in union with another. And that's a crucial component of this. At last, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, Adam says. And then, of course, we have original nakedness, where we are created with an ability to see the truth of the human person and all of their goodness as gift. We know ourselves as gift, and we receive the other as gift. And so there's no obscuring of the human person. My vision isn't clouded by lust or anything else that might prevent me from loving truly and properly. And so again, we're looking at the original man. We have the good. Then the fall, you have the distortion. And then Christ comes and you gain clarity. And then in the final stage, you gain divinization. So we're meant to become like God as he is, united with God for all eternity. And that is the goal here. So the other question you might be asking yourself, is Genesis even real? Should I give a lot of credence to this so-called theology of the body that John Paul II is talking about? Because if I think Genesis is just a bunch of nothing, if it's a bunch of silly tales, then of course I'm not going to lend much credence to this. John Paul II says in TOB 8:2 that we are dealing with a mythical language. In this case, in fact, the term myth does not refer to fictitious, fabulous content, but simply to an archaic way of expressing a deeper content. So Genesis, and the mysteriousness of it, has to be understood as a way of expressing a deeper truth. Yeah, sure, you could go learn things in a hardcore science book, and that's real. But that doesn't mean that poetry that's expressing the same thing about the human person or creation is any less real. These are two levels of expressing the truth about reality. And when it comes to some of these things, a poetic language or a mythic language is actually more proper to that expression. So the other thing to mention here, too, with regard to Genesis, is that in Genesis, there's two creation accounts. There's Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 1 is kind of the macro account. It's the objective look at the structure of creation and man. We see the days of creation. We see this objective order put into place, right? So it's sort of impersonal in a sense, but it gives us the bones and structure of creation. John Paul II said this is kind of the metaphysical view of creation. Again, don't worry if that philosophical language seems a bit much. What it means is we're just pointing to this objective structure that existed when God created the world. Genesis 2, however, can be understood as the first subjective account of man, right? So we see here not the objective view, but the micro view, the subjective first-person view of man's experience of the world. That's where we see some of the experiences of what we call the original experiences, which is what I just discussed. Original solitude, original unity, and original nakedness. An easy way to remember this is sun, S-U-N. Solitude, unity, nakedness. This is a great way to remember and understand some of this as well. So we see in Genesis 2, there's this subjective account, and they're not opposed to each other. They complement each other, right? So John Paul II, who was formed in the metaphysics of St. Thomas and in phenomenology, so the objective and subjective accounts, he's able to take that formation and understand this union of Genesis, this coherence, and how it spoke about the truth of the human person. So where many people might look at Genesis and say, that could tell me nothing about myself, it's just some old, really old book. But he's saying it's more relevant now than it has ever been. And who can we look at with regard to all this to understand our condition? Well, first of all, we can look at Mary. I mean, of course, like we said, Christ reveals man to himself. No one replaces Christ, the incarnation, God made man. But Mary is the first creature who would take on this future. She's assumed into heaven, body and soul. She's living in that eschatological state, that resurrected state, and she is our mother. And so we can look to Mary as a creature who has attained to this state to see, what does this theology of the body mean? What's it speaking to? What is my future? Well, I'm going to become like Mary, hopefully, not to the same degree, but that I will be in heaven, that is, in union with God face to face for all eternity, and that the light of God will permeate and penetrate our entire being, body and soul, and that we will be united with him, and there will be this perfect union. And that's what marriage points to. Marriage is a sign and a sacrament that points to that eternal union of Christ with the church. There's so much we could get into there, but alas, there's only so much we can do. However, Mary, and especially in the apparitions at Fatima and Lourdes and how the children describe her, gives a great account of what we can expect. It really points toward the theology of the body and what John Paul II is trying to explain. So with Mary, we can see that the body is a gift, right? The body is not an obstacle, but a gift to be lived. Mary shows us how to accept the gift of our embodiedness, and this includes our God-given sex. The body is also nuptial. The human body is nuptial because it is meant to be a sacrament of the person and an expression of the communion of persons existing between individuals. That is from Father Donald Calloway, a great priest you've probably heard of, in his book on the theology of the body and Mary. I love it because it ties together Our Lady, who John Paul II calls an icon of sorts for humanity and our hope in that regard. And it ties that together, Mary and theology of the body, in a beautiful way. And so we see that the body is a gift, it is nuptial, and again, the body is also fruitful. Mary shows us this as well. The body, everyone is meant to be fruitful, everyone. Whether or not you are called to a life of marriage, as we classically know it, if you're called to a life of consecrated virginity, if you're called to whatever it might be, you're called to give of yourself to something and to be fruitful. We're all called to be fruitful. Some are fruitful through the raising of children in big families. Some people are fruitful through their apostolates. People are fruitful in many different ways, but we must be fruitful because that's essential to our being. And of course, what that teaches us is that the body is essential. Because Mary was assumed, that shows us this isn't something that we're going to cast off and throw away. No, this is essential to our humanity. I am my body. And not only am I my body, but my body reveals God. My body reveals God. And John Paul II has a great quote here when speaking about Mary and the essentiality of the body when talking about the Assumption. Mary's Assumption reveals the nobility and dignity of the human body. In the face of the profanation and debasement to which modern society frequently subjects the female body, the mystery of the Assumption proclaims the supernatural destiny and dignity of every human body, called by the Lord to become an instrument of holiness and to share his glory. That is a beautiful statement there, pointing to what we've been talking about here, that the body is essential. It is essential. And not only is it essential, but as the human person, as the pinnacle of creation, the body has this incredible way to bring God into the created order, that we are meant to be like Christ in that regard. And so there's, need we say more to point to the dignity of the human person, right? So if we can understand where we're from, where we are, and where we're going, now we can understand our life situations. We can understand, why do I have these aches and yearnings in my heart? This eros that John Paul talks about that pushes me onward toward all that is beautiful, true, and good. And so, again, we can understand theology of the body in this very limited time that we have together, this scope. It's an explication of Genesis to do what Jesus did when he pointed us back to the beginning when he's talking about marriage. And the Pharisees are saying, but who can be married? Moses allowed us to divorce. But Jesus says, but in the beginning it was not so. And so he points to the integrity of creation. Now with that in our mind, we can go forward and we can take that vision and use it to inform how we understand the world around us. Creation, with us right there. Another way to look at it too is, imagine you're looking at a beautiful sunset, the most glorious sunset, and you're sitting there contemplating God, the beauty of his creation in that sunset. You're contemplating all of this goodness, right? And that's a beautiful experience. But what's even more beautiful in a very real sense is that at that moment, you are brighter than that sun. You, as this human being made in the image and likeness of God, with this ability and capacity to contemplate the spiritual and the divine, to be in union and relationship with the Creator, that right there is the apex of creation. That is where the beauty is. And that points us toward the dignity of the human person. That doesn't mean there's nothing wrong with looking at the sunset. Those two things are meant to go together. We're meant to contemplate God's creation because we have the spiritual capacity as body and soul. We are embodied beings. The body is not bad and somehow the spiritual is good. We are embodied beings, spiritual, corporal beings. And John Paul II is pointing at pains to this very fact, that this is the reality for which God brought us into the world, and Jesus reveals us to ourselves in this regard and in our future state. He reveals to us that the purpose of our life is to become this living love, to create a civilization of love. So going forward, I would encourage you to, one, engage, to inspire, transform, and live. It's kind of a call to action here. Engage by diving into and praying with the Theology of the Body material. Inspire by giving the gift of what you have received, which is the clarity of vision, and transform those around you by in doing so, creating a civilization of love. And live the fullness of faith as an embodied being, body and soul made in the image and likeness of God, united to the resurrected Christ. So, in conclusion here, what I would like to point at is that we are in an unprecedented age of confusion and distortion. And in this age, a great saint prophetically reminded us to go back to the beginning so that we might understand who we are, and with this knowledge, involve the whole human person in living out the fullness of faith, which is the ultimate human flourishing. As human beings, we must especially take responsibility to help those entrusted to our care. Whether you're a teacher and it's your students, you're a parent and it's your children, you're taking care of the elderly, the homeless, the sick. We have an special dignity, of course, to give ourselves and to take care of those in our flock. And we must help others to avoid the destruction and despair that await them in what John Paul II calls the culture of death. Instead, we must promote the culture of life, which is the culture where man is fully alive. Because again, remember, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. And John Paul II, this great saint who lived through such dark times, it was in persevering through that and through the grace of God and through a deep prayer life that John Paul II was able to prophetically take this vision of the human person that was given to us in divine revelation and remind the world of it. It was needed in his time, but even more so, how much is it needed now in an unprecedented time of confusion about the identity and dignity of the human person? The family and the human person are under attack. And the way that we can fight back against that is only through the truth. It's through the goodness and the beauty of the gospel. It's through the hope that is offered to us in the destiny that we were created for. So I want to thank you for allowing me to be here with you guys. I hope you're able to get something edifying and positive out of this. If nothing else, I hope this might have inspired you to delve deeper into the theology of the body. I'm absolutely positive that this would transform the Diocese of Providence. I very much look forward to coming there and speaking with you, and I hope that the theology of the body is able to bear fruit in that beautiful diocese. Thank you very much, and God bless.